The journey of the Xeno series is perhaps one of the most fascinating in all of gaming, as it's also the story of its creator, Tetsuya Takahashi. To look at his origins and see where his career has gone is a study in perseverance. That Xenoblade has become such a household name in the JRPG space is phenomenal. But what did it take to get there? How did it come about? With the release of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it's the perfect opportunity to look back not only at Takahashi's career, but the entire history of the Xeno series. You might be surprised just how much there is, and how it all begins with Final Fantasy. After 2 years of working at Nihon Falcom, first doing monster graphics for Ys 3, then general art for Dragon Slayer: The Legend of Heroes, Takahashi joined the ranks of Squaresoft. There, he continued doing graphical work for various games, namely Final Fantasy. That includes the battle graphics for Final Fantasy IV and the field graphics for Romancing Saga and Final Fantasy V. But it was with Final Fantasy VI that he first became a graphic director, and as revealed in an Iwata Asks, it was Takahashi that designed the Magitech armor that appears in the opening sequence of that game. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi had originally wanted them to look like how they did in the rest of the game, but upon seeing the design, Sakaguchi admitted it was amazing and ultimately decided to keep it. It was the first sign of Takahashi's affinity for mechs, and that would expand as he did graphic design for the original Front Mission, a strategy game focused around the bipedal armors. The final game where he worked as graphic director would be Chrono Trigger, as he was brought in to be part of the Dream Team. But it was with his next project where Takahashi would truly begin leaving his mark. During the pre-production of Final Fantasy VII, there were several different scripts being pitched by different developer teams within Squaresoft. It was around this time that Takahashi had become romantically involved and married his co-worker, Kaori Tanaka, who would eventually go by the pen name of Soraya Saga. She is a legend in her own right, notably working on Final Fantasy VI, where she created the characterization of the brothers Edgar and Sabin. She first chose their classes, then their desert setting, before crafting an extensive character background that she would work from. Expanding upon her love of writing, she drafted a story pitch for the next Final Fantasy. Takahashi then brought that proposal to Square's executives, but it was rejected because they felt it was too dark and complicated for a fantasy. The pair were then assigned to the proposal that was accepted as Final Fantasy VII, but Takahashi found himself growing bored. He also fundamentally disagreed with the decision to use pre-rendered backgrounds instead of 3D environments. He felt 3D would be a much more effective method of immersing the player. Eventually, he approached Hironobu Sakaguchi and asked permission to explore his own ideas. Sakaguchi agreed, believing he could now lead a project on his own, and decided to give him a separate team that would work on a proposed sequel to Chrono Trigger. This would not lead to Chrono Trigger's actual sequel, Chrono Cross, as the team soon clashed with executives over what form it would take, among other complications within Squaresoft. Despite this, Sakaguchi pushed for Takahashi to be able to lead his own game, and it was eventually given the green light. Project Noah, as it came to be called, was an amalgamation of everything Takahashi and Soraya Saga had come to love. The story they crafted combined elements of Saga's Final Fantasy VII proposal with Takahashi's love of complex philosophical themes, influenced by him reading the works of Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Carl Jung. They also combined the fantasy setting of Saga's initial idea with the science fiction aesthetic that they had begun to develop for the Chrono Trigger sequel, leading to a melding of the two. This would be best evidenced by the mechs that would be in the game, which Takahashi had enjoyed since childhood. As told by Sakaguchi, it wouldn't take long for his desk to become filled with Gundam models and other toys upon taking on the project. Ambition would be the hallmark of Project Noah, as they wanted it to be a story about artificial intelligence, love, and the origin and future of mankind. It was an epic of grand proportions, even beyond this initial game. But he felt this portion of the story was the easiest to grasp, while the rest of the tale could be relayed via other mediums. That proposed full story will be easier to relate a little later though. Nonetheless, their idea attracted quite the team, including Chrono Trigger's composer and art director Yasunori Mitsuda and Yasuyuki Hane respectively, along with Ys 3's character designer Kunihiko Tanaka. The producer would be Hiromichi Tanaka, who had previously fulfilled the same role for Secret of Mana and directed Trials of Mana. With the team in place, they were finally ready to make their game. Project Noah would release in 1998 as Xenogears, with Xeno standing for the unknown and Gears representing the mechs within the game. The story focuses on the character of Fei Fong Wong, a young amnesiac who has been living in the small village of Lahan for the past 3 years. He has built a life for himself alongside the town's Dr. Seaton and the other villagers. And up until this point, Lahan has been able to stay out of a centuries-long war between the nations of Ave and Kislev. But a new power has arisen in the form of the Gebler army, which aids Ave and begins turning the tide of the war. In this effort, Gebler attacks Lahan, and something awakens within Fei when he pilots an abandoned mech, collectively known as Gears. This incident leads him and Seaton to leave the village, discover the hidden truths of the world, and how his past ties into it. Battles in Xenogears are split between two variations, on-foot combat and gear combat. While on foot, Fei and his allies use Final Fantasy's active time battle system to determine the turn order, but fighting itself is quite different. Normal attacks are performed by choosing a series of weak, moderate, and strong hits, with each option costing action points or AP. At the beginning of the game, only 3 AP is available per attack, with weak costing 1, moderate 2, and strong 3. But the AP pool expands as the party levels up. Adding more depth are the death blow combinations, which are gradually learned from repeating specific combinations of the various attacks. Naturally, these combos do much more damage than a typical attack. It's also possible to save AP in order to combine death blows for even greater damage. And then later in the game there are elemental death blows which add elemental attributes to the attacks. Along with the standard fight option, characters have access to magic in the form of ether, though for story reasons it may be listed as something else depending on the character. Gear combat is mostly the same, though there are tweaks that change up the strategies. Instead of AP, the limiting factor for each turn is the gear's fuel, as every attack consumes a certain amount depending on its power. Death blows are available, but only after building up the attack level by using normal strikes. For each level, an additional death blow can be performed with a maximum of 3. However, there is an infinity mode that could possibly trigger if the gear is at attack level 3 and doesn't use a death blow. While in this mode, which lasts 3 turns, Gears can regain more fuel through the charge command and unleash infinity attacks for even greater damage. Gears also have access to boosters that allow them to act faster at the cost of more fuel. This is integral as a gear with no fuel cannot attack at all. It must be charged until there's enough fuel for those actions. Ether can also be used and is generally more effective while in a gear, though some are completely unavailable. Square had given the team a year and a half to develop the game, but with most of the staff and budget of the company going toward Final Fantasy VII, Takahashi's team of 30 was mostly inexperienced newcomers. Compromises simply had to be made if the game was going to finish on time. For example, although Takahashi had wanted to pursue his vision of a fully 3D modeled game, the inexperience of the team made that a challenge. Instead, they decided to place 2D sprites on 3D backgrounds, creating more of an anime look. This carried over to the cutscenes as 2D animations could more easily capture the designs of the various gears. But it was the story that ended up most affected as it grew in size and scope over time. Squaresoft even allowed the team an extra 6 months to finish, but it simply wouldn't be enough to tell this grand story. It's for this reason that much of the second disc consisted of a narration of events, highlighting how the characters progressed. Takahashi would later admit that this was due to the inexperience of himself and his team rather than the budget. But rather than end prematurely with the events of the first disc as Square executives suggested, Takahashi proposed a narration compromise that allowed him to finish on schedule while telling a complete story. Xenogears was met with near universal acclaim, selling nearly 900,000 units in Japan over the course of its release year and 1.2 million copies worldwide by 2003. Critics praised its deep story and rich characters, though some bemoaned the lengthy cutscenes, especially in the second half. There were also some who found the philosophical ideas too much to parse at times. Still, the gameplay was well regarded, with many enjoying the uniqueness of the gear combat. Exploration was highlighted, mostly thanks to the ability to jump and climb through environments, making them feel less static, especially with a fully rotatable camera. The game remained one of the highlights of the PlayStation's library for years, as in the early 2000s, Xenogears would often appear on fan-voted best game of all time lists. But really, it's a small miracle the game was localized for the West at all. Square was hesitant due to the presence of sensitive religious issues throughout the game, but this was overcome thanks to translators working closely with the development team. It was a first for Square, but it proved essential to keep the game as faithful as possible while changing as much as they could to avoid any controversy. In fact, the original translation team either quit or asked to be reassigned due to the sheer difficulty along with all the scientific and philosophic concepts. It ultimately fell to Richard Honeywood to translate the entire game himself, a project he considered pure hell. However, it would lead to a shift in how Square's games were localized. Translators' workspaces were moved closer to the development teams to improve communication, while full-time editors were hired. In addition, a familiarization and glossary creation period was added to the translation schedule so that the team could develop a consistent style and characterization guide for the project. The changes worked as Honeywood would go on to translate Final Fantasies 8 through 11, Chrono Cross, and Dragon Quest VIII. But, as I said before, Xenogears was unique in just how grand it is, with this only being a small portion of the story Takahashi envisioned. Many were caught off guard when the game reveals at the end that it was actually episode 5 of 6, and this was later elaborated in the Xenogears Perfect Works book. Each part was supposed to be told through a different medium, with episode 1 taking place 15,000 years before the game and set during an interplanetary war. Episode 2 would focus on the genesis of the planet 10,000 years ago when the character of Abel lived. Episode 3 would take place 4,000 years ago during the height of the Zebrawim civilization when the character of Kim lived. Episode 4 would focus on the Solaris War 500 years before Xenogears, the period when Lacan and Sophia lived. Episode 6 would have ended the storyline, though it's unknown in what way. Many of these choices make sense in context, but are obviously massive spoilers to explain in full. Ultimately, these ideas would not come to fruition while Takahashi was at Squaresoft. He had begun planning a sequel, but the company's investments into Final Fantasy The Spirits Within forced its cancellation. There was also an unconfirmed rumor that Square wanted it to sell 1 million units before greenlighting a sequel. At 900,000, it just fell short. Frustrated by the company's focus on Final Fantasy, Takahashi eventually decided to leave the developer in 1999, and he wouldn't be alone. Hirohide Sugiura, the producer of Air Guys, had been a fan of Xenogears throughout its development, but noticed that Takahashi was having trouble getting other projects off the ground at Square. The two began to talk and came to an agreement to leave the company and start their own. They would be joined by a large portion of the staff that had worked on Xenogears, including that game's art director, Yasuyuki Hane. Sugiura would become the president, while Takahashi and Hane would become directors on their own projects. However, rather than go independent, they realized they needed a publisher with market presence. Most companies rejected their offer, but Namco, specifically its founder Masaya Nakamura, showed interest in investing into the new company as a dedicated subsidiary. This would allow the newly formed Monolith Soft to focus on game development, while Namco handled logistics and marketing. The first project of this new partnership would be codenamed Project X, which went into development in 2000 with a staff of 60 to 100 people, 20 of them having previously worked on Xenogears. It was seen as a spiritual successor to that game, a planned 6-part series that would carry over its themes while attempting to fully convey Takahashi's vision with a new cast, as reflected by the Xeno moniker. He once again wrote the story with Saga while acting as the game's director. However, to ensure the development stayed focused, he consulted the entire staff on the script's direction before the main production even began. Development was not easy though, as the team had to learn how to work with a far more powerful PlayStation 2 for the first time, though this did allow Takahashi to achieve his vision of a game with full 3D visuals. Still, this learning period, both for the new hardware and the mostly inexperienced staff, lasted around a year, leaving only an additional year to complete the entire game. In fact, the graphics engine wasn't fully finished until 6 months before the planned release. Those graphics provided another challenge as the character designs were done by Kunihiko Tanaka, who had previously handled designs for Xenogears. Translating those designs into 3D was the major problem, as his characters tended to have large eyes dominating their faces. Still, Takahashi wanted to be as close to the original artwork as possible, despite the facial designs easily becoming distorted in the wrong lighting, something the team worked hard to avoid. Even then, the sheer ambition of the project forced the team to cut back on some of those ideas, one of which was allowing the player to explore the world in mechs. In the end, Takahashi claimed that only 20% of the content initially planned actually made it into this first game. That game would be released in 2002 as Xenosaga Episode I, Der Will zur Macht, or The Will to Power. The story focuses on a human race far in the future that has colonized thousands of planets, while Earth itself has been lost. But the future is uncertain as a mysterious alien race known as the Gnosis has devastated the population, forcing them to find some way to fight back. One such method is an android known as Cosmos, developed by a woman named Shion, who is put to the test during a sudden Gnosis attack. This ultimately puts them in contact with a faction known as the UTIC organization that has its own sets of goals and desires, namely involving an artifact called the Zohar. Little do they know that their journey to safety will set them on a path to learn about the mysteries of the universe and what they mean for humanity. That plot summary is woefully insufficient in conveying the true sense of scale to the story, as there are countless characters, concepts, locations, and items that make it a true space opera. The game's themes are once again pulled from biblical mythology and the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, hence the game's subtitle, which symbolized the cast's strength of will. But these grand ideas also led to an infamous amount of cutscenes, 7 hours in total. One spanned a total of 40 minutes with a save option popping up in the middle. Needless to say, it caused a divide between the audience, with some enjoying the story being told, while others felt it was far too excessive. What held it together was gameplay that had evolved from what it was in Xenogears, translating and updating many of that game's ideas. One of the biggest advances was getting rid of random battles, as all enemies could be seen in the overworld and avoided if the player chose. Like Xenogears, Xenosaga had characters use a string of different attacks for normal strikes, with the amount determined by action points, or AP. 4 AP is given at the start of a turn, and any not used can be saved for the next for a maximum of 6, allowing the character to unleash even more attacks. Unlike Xenogears, the 3 face buttons do not correspond to weak, moderate, and heavy attacks. Instead, Square utilizes short-range physical moves, while Triangle uses long-range ether-based attacks, with each costing 2 AP. The circle button is dedicated to launching tech attacks, although the character will need 6 AP to trigger it, 2 from each normal attack, and 2 to actually activate the tech. Completing battles award tech points that can be spent to upgrade a character's unlocked tech attacks, allowing them to be used sooner in combat. In addition to tech points, which can also be spent to increase stats, battles grant ether and skill points. Ether points unlock new ether skills for a character, while skill points are used to extract special commands from accessories. Up to 3 of these skills can be set on each character. More importantly, each attack increases a character's boost gauge, which can then be used to immediately receive a turn, interrupting enemy units and even other party members. Finally, there are the mechs known as eggs, or anti-Gnosis weapon systems. While visually similar to the gears from Xenogears, they're more in line with summons from Final Fantasy. That said, it is possible to upgrade the eggs to make them more powerful. Each character is assigned to a different mech, though not all of them can actually use one. Those that can are given special attacks and improved stats while inside. However, they can only be used for a certain amount of turns and have limited ammunition. Healing is also locked away while using the eggs. The game is mostly linear as it contains no world map whatsoever, though there are side activities players can take part in. These include a method of revisiting past locations and several minigames. None of the minigames are that involved, but they do serve to break up the gameplay and consist of a treasure hunt, a drilling game, a casino, a battle arena, and a card game. Xenosaga Episode I was a solid success for Namco, selling 240,000 units within 3 days of its Japanese release. By year's end, it was the 7th best-selling game of 2002, and it did just as well globally, with Namco reporting that 4 months after its Western release, the game had sold over 1 million units. Critics widely praised its world, characters, and depth, with some comparing it to a good science fiction novel. Many did note that it appeared convoluted at first glance, but enjoyed the gradual reveal of the gameplay's depths and customization. However, the eggs and minigames were seen as mostly lackluster, while the impression of the graphics and character designs were something of a mixed bag. The music was highly praised, though some bemoaned that it could be scarce at times. While Takahashi did have to scale back to get Episode I released, it was successful enough that he could at least continue his vision. But 2 months before Xenosaga Episode II released in 2004, a smaller game was made available to satiate its fans and begin Namco's attempt to turn the series into a multimedia franchise. Hence, Xenosaga Freaks was released exclusively in Japan. It's not really a traditional game though. Instead, it's more of a primer on the series with some extra scenarios aimed at fans. This is mainly done through Xenokami, which is a visual novel focused on small vignettes centered around the 7 main members of the cast. There's nothing plot important involved and is more about laid-back fun with the characters. There's also Kotaba no Puzzle Xenopatan, which is a Xenosaga-themed version of Namco's Scrabble-like puzzler Kotaba no Puzzle Mojipatan. It is heavily based around Japanese, as players use hiragana to build words. Only one tile may be placed per turn, which must be next to any other tile. However, it cannot be set unless it forms a word. Players don't work from a blank slate though, as stages have objectives such as fill all the spots on the board or create 20 words over 3 tiles long. Although this game's inclusion might seem odd to us in the West, Mojipatan is quite popular in Japan, even receiving a Switch release in 2020. The rest of Xenosaga Freaks contains an encyclopedia of terms from the original game and a demo of the upcoming sequel. It's hard to say how well Freaks did, as it was sold at a lower price, but there's no information on its critical reception. Instead, there's mostly import impressions that break down its content. Still, it wasn't long before fans got what they were really waiting for. Xenosaga Episode II and, pardon my German, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, or Beyond Good and Evil, picks up where Episode 1 left off, making a plot synopsis tricky as it heavily deals with the fallout of the original game. This time, Shion shares the focus with fellow party member Junior, although every character has more of their backstory revealed. The Zohar remains a key item with multiple parties attempting to claim it. But what could that mean for the universe? The subtitle, Beyond Good and Evil, was meant to symbolize the blurring between right and wrong, as well as Junior's complex relationship with the villain Albedo. Episode 2 could be seen as a repositioning phase, both for the characters and the developers. While sales of the first game were good, it wasn't enough to support a 6-episode epic, especially at Takahashi's proposed scale. No matter what, the story was going to be affected. And while Takahashi and Saga still wrote the concept and scenario draft together, it was Norihiko Yamasaka who previously wrote the scenario for Front Mission 3 and the Xenokami section of Xenosaga Freaks, who turned those drafts into a full script. Takahashi himself admitted that it was quite the task, as that game script had to be crafted from the extensive notes that he and Saga had written. This required much of the planned storyline to be condensed or cut. The team would compare it to how a novel is adapted into a movie. That said, these changes would lead to a butterfly effect, resulting in even more subsequent shifts to the original planned plotline. But it wasn't just the story that saw changes. The entire project was reevaluated, with much of the team getting shuffled around in order to provide newer staff a chance at handling the series. That included Takahashi, who stepped down from his role as director to manage other responsibilities at Monolith Soft. For him, this was his way of not limiting the scope of Xenosaga, which seems a bit ironic considering he felt that his style of direction could result in development extending exponentially. The more likely reason was he knew Episode 2 had to release on time and within budget, since the original game had ballooned in cost, reaching about 1 billion yen. In his place, Ko Arai took the director's chair, having been a map designer in both Xenogears and Xenosaga Episode 1. Development took another 2 years, with a staff of 60 to 100 people split between scene, battle, and quest teams. Tomohiro Hagiwara, the game's new producer, wished to turn Xenosaga into an evolving series rather than a static one, and set out to adjust much of the gameplay with a focus on streamlining the system and making it easier to understand. It was also decided that the cast should be redesigned to take on a more realistic appearance, feeling it would increase their expressiveness and broaden the series' appeal. While the basics of Xenosaga Episode 2's combat remains the same, there are a number of enhancements and changes to the systems in play. For example, normal attacks are still determined by the phase buttons, but now each corresponds to an area of the enemy. Triangle is low, square is mid, and circle is high. By focusing on a specific area, it's possible to perform a zone break, forcing the enemy into a break state that decreases their defense. Certain characters can then follow this up to cause even more damage thanks to air attacks and down attacks, which launch them into the air or knock them to the ground respectively. This then allows the other party members to do greater damage. In many ways, it can be seen as a precursor to Xenoblade Chronicles combo attacks that would become a hallmark of those later games. There's also the stock system, which allows a character to store up to 3 circle attacks to be used later. More importantly, rather than 3 standard moves in a row, they could be expended to unleash a character's super combo or a double attack with another party member. While the returning boost mostly works the same, there have been some changes. For one, it now applies to the entire party rather than each individual member, with the total remaining from fight to fight. The enemy boost gauge can now be seen as well, which also carries over between fights. This does apply to bosses, which makes planning for those fights somewhat of a necessity. Finally, the eggs have been replaced by the new ES robots, although there are only 3 in the game and only 2 can be active in a battle at a time. Each ES has a fixed main pilot, but the sub-pilot can be changed, allowing the player to choose what types of attacks it'll utilize. They're also used much more often, even earning their own experience and levels. These changes helped ES robots feel more like an extension of a player's combat options rather than the summon-like quality of the eggs. However, there were some major changes to Episode 2 outside of combat. The strangest was the complete removal of money and shops. Instead, new items and accessories could only be obtained through battles or by exploring the environment. To help players earn more equipment and to make the game feel less linear, side quests play a larger role, as they can even unlock optional dungeons. This then opens up the possibility of discovering even better equipment. The game was simplified in other areas as well, with character diversity being eliminated outside of default attacks. Tech attacks can no longer be learned or upgraded, while the character-specific ether trees have been replaced by a skill system that sees everyone learning the same thing. These changes led to more of a mixed reaction amongst critics. While it was still mostly positive, many noted that the simplified nature of its character growth systems brought down the experience. It's unfortunate too, as the actual combat was praised as faster and more approachable. Many enjoyed the inclusion of side quests, but lamented the lack of shops. Likewise, critics enjoyed the new realistic art style and visual fidelity, though they found the audio design lacking, in particular the voice acting, with many missing the original voice actors of Shion and Cosmos. More importantly, Yasunori Mitsuda did not return to compose the soundtrack, leading to some finding the new score somewhat lacking. Finally, opinions on the story were all over the place, with some enjoying the greater focus on the cast, while most felt that the story was becoming needlessly complicated while barely pushing the plot forward. Sales-wise, it sold 186,000 units in Japan in its first week, reaching second place on the charts, while it sold an additional 32,000 units in its second week. However, 7 months after its Japanese release, it was only reported to have sold 280,000 units in total. No exact figures were given for its Western release, but Namco did say it was one of its better-selling titles in North America. In the end, the game simply failed to meet Namco's expectations, reaching just over 50% of its projected sales target, and that's despite Episode 2 releasing in Europe, the only game in the Xenosaga series to do so. Monolith's fortunes had seen a shift, but Xenosaga as a franchise wasn't exactly finished. There were plenty more projects that would see release before the next main entry in the saga. In fact, less than half a month after Episode 2's release, Chapter 1, Part 1 of Xenosaga Pied Piper came to mobile phones. Set 100 years before the events of Episode 1, Pied Piper focuses on the character of Ziggy, someone Takahashi planned to elaborate on within Episode 2, but was unable to make happen. Pied Piper came about when Monolith Soft was contacted by Namco's mobile division, who asked if they could work with them on a mobile property. The team used this opportunity to tell Ziggy's story. Naturally, that story was co-written by Takahashi and Saga, though this was his wife's last contribution to the series, as she left the project in 2005, though no reason was officially given. She was simply informed that her services would no longer be needed. She still helped Monolith Soft in the future, although in a more limited capacity, writing the scenario for Soma Bringer and designing the Xenoblade Chronicles II blade, Gorg. Pied Piper consisted of 3 chapters, each split into 2 parts, which were released on Vodafone devices from July 14, 2004 to October 13th. It would also get released on NTT Docomo's iMode service in 2006, though the game is mostly considered lost media. Thankfully, Pied Piper's script has been translated into English, and footage eventually surfaced of the game, which is what you're currently watching. Gameplay was kept mostly simple due to the device, but there were still some impressive elements. The game was explored from a 2D overhead perspective, with enemies still appearing on the overworld and able to be avoided. The combat mechanics are mostly pulled from Episode 1, such as the boost system carrying over from that game. Each character specialized in specific actions, while special attacks could be performed using points accumulated from killing enemies in other battles. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say how the game was received or how well it sold, as no information seems to be available online at all. While it is unfortunate that Western fans missed out on this, Xenosaga Episode 3 would include an extensive plot summary of Pied Piper and details on its characters. Fortunately, the next Xenosaga project would see a localization. Xenosaga the Animation released in January of 2005 and covers the events of the first game. Although initially unplanned, the game's modest worldwide success led to the adaptation being commissioned as part of Namco's multimedia push. Produced by Toei Animation in association with TV Asahi, the series was directed by Tsuyoshi Koga, who had previously worked on animes such as Gegege no Kitaro, One Piece, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Bobobo Bo Bobobo. The script was handled by Yuichiro Takeda of Banner of the Stars and The King of Braves Gao Geiger, while the characters were adapted for the anime by Nobuteru Yuki, who previously designed characters in Record of Lodoss War. His goal was to emulate the style of Episode 1 while adjusting them to remain distinct. Although none of the staff from the game were involved with the anime, the team had a policy of keeping as much of the original game's plot and scenes as possible, including any unresolved mysteries. Still, many elements of Episode 1 had to be altered, and the decision was made to showcase some characters and ideas from Episode 2. One such example was Shion's brother being introduced sooner and given a larger role. However, other characters were left out entirely, while newly introduced characters had to be approved by Monolith Soft. It was originally licensed for America by ADV in 2007, where it was met with mixed criticism. The animation was seen as poor in certain areas, while anyone not familiar with the game would find themselves lost. But it also elaborated on many elements and provided some extra clarity to fans. For many, it's seen as a kind of companion to the games, but that's not why I wanted to highlight the project. It's actually an important piece of history for Monolith Soft as a whole, as it would directly lead to the development of an upcoming side game while bringing on Yuichiro Takeda, a key figure in the storytelling of every Xenoblade Chronicles entry. But before that, it was time to show the crossover potential of the Xenosaga characters. Released in May of 2005, Namco X Capcom was the third IP developed at Monolith after Xenosaga and Baten Kaitos. While none of the staff that worked on Xenosaga were part of this team, it was a project proposed by Monolith Soft themselves to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Namco. Yet despite the large roster of characters, the team wanted even more. To this end, Namco reached out to Capcom for a collaboration due to their massive character lineup. They agreed, leading this to become their second major collaboration with another publisher after SNK vs. Capcom. Naturally, this being Monolith Soft, they included their own characters from Xenosaga in the project. Shion, Momo, and Cosmos all appeared in the strategy RPG, with the first two being a paired unit, while Cosmos was solo. Cosmos was even given a prominent position on both the box art and within the game's opening. Notably, despite Monolith Soft developing, no Baten Kaitos characters appeared in the game, which could be an indication of just how popular Xenosaga was at the time, at least comparatively. The game was a hit upon release, with many critics praising the character interactions and fan service, although the gameplay itself was deemed too simple and repetitious. Namco X Capcom was never localized though, due to the immense script and the obscurity of many of the characters. Speaking of obscure, there's Xenosaga II to III, A Missing Year, which isn't a game release at all. Instead, it's more of a visual short story that was released for free on Namco's Japanese website sometime in late 2005 or early 2006. Over the course of 6 chapters, it tells of what Shion, Cosmos, and some of the characters closest to them were doing in the year between Xenosaga Episode 2 and 3. While the character development is considered important to longtime fans, it's not absolutely necessary to enjoy Episode 3. Thankfully, while it's no longer available on Namco's website, it was fan-translated and uploaded to YouTube as part of a preservation effort. However, there was one more game released before that next entry, and it would be Monolith's first project on the Nintendo DS. Xenosaga I and II for the DS is basically a miracle, as almost the entire story of those two games were squeezed onto the handheld cartridge along with supplementary material that fleshed out some of its elements. Of course, it's not an exact retelling, as there are some major changes, primarily to the events of Episode 2, as it originally focused on the perspective of the character Junior. But in an effort to keep the story consistent, this DS release kept the focus on Shion. In many ways, Xenosaga I and II is truer to Takahashi's original vision of the series. He created the draft based on those initial plans, as they required significant alteration for the original releases due to aforementioned time and design limitations. While Episode 1 didn't need as many changes, Episode 2 was essentially rewritten, as it originally only made up roughly 30% of the entire game, which was seen as an obvious imbalance. To address this, flashback sequences were rearranged to maintain a better flow, while still greatly expanding on the character of Junior. Episode 2 characters were also given minor cameos during the events of Episode 1. Ultimately, this served to fill in many of the plot holes of Episode 2's original release, allowing players to have a better understanding of the story in the upcoming Episode 3. Takahashi's writing partner in this endeavor was the previously mentioned writer of Xenosaga the Animation, Yuichiro Takeda. While Takeda initially believed the writing process would only take 6 months, the sheer amount of rewrites forced it to be even longer. Takeda even ended up visiting Monolith's offices once a week to discuss the script. Development of the game began in earnest after the completion of Xenosaga the Animation, with the project overseen by both Monolith Soft and the external studio Tom Create, who had previously worked on licensed anime games and the original Front Mission. This partnership came about as it was Monolith's first time developing for a handheld system. Much of the staff who had worked on the Xenosaga anime also worked on 1 and 2, including the drawing director, cutscene director, and composer. Their background proved to be quite helpful, as the game used a 2D art style to keep as much of the story from being cut as possible. Likewise, the voice acting was unsurprisingly limited to victory quotes in battle. Another method of squeezing the games onto the DS was to use an isometric perspective to display the sprites while hand-drawn sequences and character portraits relayed the story. It was an understandable change, as was the unfortunate presence of random battles. Those battles mostly followed the systems of the original Xenosaga, except for the presence of a 5x6 grid divided evenly between the party and enemies. Each character can move around the grid on their turn to create formations with the rest of the party. These formations can then trigger buffs such as regenerating health or AP, with specific formations locked to certain characters. For the most part, critics enjoyed the game, with many feeling that the story was the main reason to pick it up. The streamlining of the gameplay and battle system were praised as well, though some found the game surprisingly challenging. Many felt the pacing was generally improved, though some still found all the terminology overwhelming. That said, the critical praise did not carry over into commercial success, as the game debuted outside the top 10. A mere 17,000 units were moved that first week, with 38,500 copies sold over the course of 9 months. It was another sign that the Xenosaga series was on its last legs, and likely led to the decision not to localize the game for a Western release. Which brings us to the final Xenosaga game ever to be released, barring some kind of HD remaster down the line. Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Released in 2006, it continues the tradition of Nietzsche quotes as titles, though this one is a little less obvious than the others, as it's the title to a Nietzsche novel, specifically the one that popularized the phrase, "God is dead." Considering the heavy religious themes of Xenosaga and the common final boss of RPGs in general, it's an apropos moniker. The story of Episode 3 focuses once again on Shion as she comes to terms with what she discovered in the previous episode. She must pick up the pieces to see what comes next for humanity as she investigates the true origins of the Zohar, the entity known as Zarathustra, and what happened to Earth. Episode 3's production began during the final stages of development for Episode 2, with much of the staff retaining their roles. Ko Arai returned as director, Takahashi continued supervising the story, and Norihiko Yamasaka crafted the script. The team's goals for the game were twofold: bring the story to a satisfactory conclusion while addressing the criticism of Episode 2's short length and the general issues of the series up until that point. This final form was based on both the staff's ideas and fan feedback to ultimately create a game they felt was close to their ideal. One such change was the art style, as it attempted to strike a balance between the anime look of the first game and the realism of the second. However, according to Soraya Saga, the many changes to the original narrative plan for Episode 2 resulted in multiple shifts in Episode 3. Much of this includes elements that were intended for Episode 2, but had to be cut due to time constraints. So Episode 3 is as close to that vision as the team could achieve within their time and budget, but still far different to what Saga had originally envisioned. The team also reworked most of the battle system. The zones and zone breaks of Episode 2 were scrapped along with square, triangle, and circle corresponding to different types of attacks. Instead, like most other RPGs, it only had a singular attack option and a separate list of text to utilize alongside the returning ether. Both pull from the character's ether points, but techs are focused mainly on doing more damage than typical strikes or unleashing break damage, which ties into the reworked break system. Both the player party and enemy units can enter a break status, as indicated by a red bar. If this happens, the unit will appear dizzied and be unable to act for several turns. Techs that specifically target break will obviously cause it to happen faster, but there are break heals that can be performed to keep the status at bay. Barring that, the ability to swap out party members at the cost of an action returns from Episode 2 and will save the swap character from the status. It's something to be more concerned about during longer battles as the break gauge resets between each fight. The boost system returns as well, with only minimal changes from Episode 2, as it is still shared amongst the party. However, slightly more can be done with it, as players can use all their stored boost on a braked enemy to inflict massive damage in a row from special attacks. This could be made even more potent as there is equipment that increases the maximum boost gauge, from 3 to a maximum of 9. Speaking of special attacks, they can be made more powerful the more often they're used, which is helpful if the player wants to achieve a finishing strike bonus. By ending a battle with a special attack, players are granted more experience and money from that fight. Effort was also taken to ensure each character played differently from one another thanks to the new skill line. Every character's skill line is comprised of 2 branches, structured after a specific class, allowing for far more individuality amongst the party in comparison to Episode 2. ES robots return with some minor changes in line with the rest of the game's battle updates, such as their own special attacks. Most significantly is that 3 of the mechs can be used in battle at once. All of these changes worked in the game's favor, at least critically. The new battle systems were highly praised, though some felt it was too straightforward with only minimal side activities to take part in. Some also wished that more new elements were introduced to the battles, while others found the game lacked any kind of real challenge. The presentation was lauded, especially the return of Shion and Cosmos' English voice actors from Episode 1. However, there were still a lot of cutscenes, totaling over 9 hours across the game. Critics were split on how well the game came to a conclusion though. Most agreed that all the loose ends were tied up, but how satisfying it was depended on the person. Some called it a triumph and the best part of the game, while others felt it was too long-winded and philosophical to allow the characters to have any personality. The Western release was also criticized for much of its censorship, as most of the blood was removed from cutscenes. This was done to prevent an M rating, but it left scenes harder to decipher as characters reacted to things that weren't there. Unfortunately, while Episode 3 sold better than Xenosaga on the DS, it was still a lower debut than the previous titles at 124,000 units. In 6 months, it reached 181,000 copies sold in Japan, with that number reaching 343,000 after its North American release. This was simply not enough to save the series, and with its release, Xenosaga Episode 3 became the final game in the series. But that release marked a massive shift for Monolith Soft as a whole, as the relationship with Namco had been on the rocks for years. One of the tenets of Monolith was fostering young developers and giving them a chance to grow. To that end, Baten Kaitos was developed as their second game in 2003, specifically to allow the younger staff a way to try their ideas. The game was made with the GameCube in mind, as there weren't many RPGs on the system. This put the game's director Yasuyuki Hane in contact with Satoru Iwata. It turns out Nintendo was toying around with the idea of a third game in the Mother series, and Iwata suggested to Hane to pitch the idea to the series creator, Shigesato Itoi. Hane created a felt-like design to the world and characters, but Itoi ultimately rejected the idea. Still, it marked the beginnings of the two companies' relationship. And that relationship would eventually be further fostered due to the retirement of Masaya Nakamura as head of Namco. Nakamura had believed in Monolith's ideals and goals to foster young talent and create new ideas, but with his retirement, Namco began to shift away from that mindset. This led to Monolith being given less creative freedom, especially after the merger between Bandai and Namco. It was then that the company received a consultation from Shinji Hatano, a key player in Nintendo's courting of companies. It was he who was largely responsible for getting Square Enix games back on Nintendo consoles, who added first-party characters to third-party games such as Link in Soul Calibur 2, and fostered the idea of Mario spin-offs such as Mario Party and Mario and Luigi. He advised Monolith to make something that couldn't be found elsewhere in the industry, something original with an independent spirit. This inspired them to break away from Namco and become a Nintendo subsidiary. Nintendo would provide Monolith creative freedom in exchange for software exclusivity on Nintendo platforms. Nintendo's purchase of the majority of Monolith Soft shares was publicly announced in early 2007, leading to them owning 80% of the company's shares, while Bandai Namco retained 16%. They would also remain a development partner, with Bandai Namco stating that the exchange of Monolith would strengthen their relationship with Nintendo. And while this comes across as meaningless PR speak, it actually bore fruit. They had developed Nintendo games in the past, such as Star Fox Assault, Donkey Konga, and Mario Kart Arcade GP, but it really took off after 2007, with Bandai Namco aiding in the development of Super Smash Bros. Wii U, 3DS, and Ultimate, Mario Kart 8, Mario Kart Tour, and ARMS. Then there's the games they fully developed, such as Pokken Tournament and New Pokemon Snap. It really does seem to have strengthened the bond between the two companies. It was also an anomaly for Nintendo, as they did not typically take part in mergers and acquisitions of other companies. To explain this, Iwata stated that the deal was initiated due to the positive relations between them and Monolith, along with their parallel design and development philosophies. But the question still remained at the time: would Monolith Soft, a developer whose ambitions often outweighed their capabilities, make for a good fit with Nintendo? The results of this partnership first took shape in 2008 with the release of their first and, to date, only non-RPG, Disaster Day of Crisis, and Takahashi's Japanese-exclusive Soma Bringer on the DS. Both of these were far different from what they had developed before, and marked the start of a shift for Monolith as a whole. That's because, up until this point, Takahashi's games began by creating a massive story, then molding a game around that idea. But as had been the case with every prior Xeno game, the scope would get expanded and the team would end up over budget, behind schedule, or both. For Soma Bringer, an action RPG in the vein of Diablo, his team assessed the resources available right away and then calculated how much gameplay content they could create before crafting a story around those projections. It was unlike anything Takahashi had ever done, and many suspected that it was either due to the Nintendo acquisition not being finalized during development, or because it was their first time solely developing a DS game. Perhaps both. This didn't mean the story was left to flounder though. Instead, Takahashi worked once again with Saga to create this world, including a larger universe that the player wouldn't even see in this game. They carefully picked the elements that would fit best into the game, and it worked, as Soma Bringer was a modest sales success, and critics and importers found it to be a deep experience that was fun despite bringing nothing new to the genre. This allowed Takahashi to move on to another project that had been brewing in his mind since before Soma Bringer, while Monolith Soft released another crossover game developed in conjunction with Banpresto, Super Robot Wars OG Saga Endless Frontier. While the game was published by Bandai Namco in Japan and Atlus in the West, it did follow Nintendo's edict as it was a DS exclusive. It also featured several Xenosaga and Namco X Capcom cameos, namely Cosmos and her fan-favorite rival introduced in Episode 3, Telos. Naturally, Cosmos could join the player's party, while Telos twice served as a boss during the game. They share many of the same attacks, though the coloring differs. They also have unique supers with animations that, well, bring new meaning to the term chestburster. Endless Frontier would eventually get a sequel in 2010 with Super Robot Wars OG Saga Endless Frontier Exceed, where both Cosmos and Telos return and act basically the same, though Momo from Xenosaga is also included. Unlike Cosmos, she's a support unit, only coming in to help with attacks. The game showed that Monolith still had a fondness for the characters, and Bandai Namco was willing to let them be used. But in the intervening time, Takahashi had begun to work on his new idea. one where rival civilizations emerged on the frozen bodies of two warring gods. He soon showed a draft to the other senior staff at Monolith, who were all impressed. In fact, Yasuyuki Hane decided to buy the materials to create a 3D model of the gods. They even used younger staff to act as models so Takahashi could decide which parts of the gods' bodies could be explorable environments. Each pose served as a different idea for these locations. Once the model was finished, they presented the idea to Nintendo and explained how players would explore, working their way up from the legs to the head, with each area exhibiting different weather and terrain based on where it was located. However, that was all they had prepared by the time they brought the idea and the model to Nintendo for approval. It was there that Hitoshi Yamagami, a longtime director at Nintendo, who had also co-developed the creation of Panel Depon, first heard the pitch. He had grown into a producer role in recent years and had overseen most games from Fire Emblem and Pokemon. In fact, it had been him who had encouraged Monolith Soft to do what they did best in crafting RPG worlds, but with a theme of romanticism in mind. Even so, he was not prepared for Takahashi's approach to making games. As he related the story in an Iwata asks, when he saw the massive model they created and the general pitch, he assumed they must have settled on finer details as well. But nope, it was just the model. Despite those lacking details, Yamagami still decided to approve and champion the project. In many ways, his influence saved Monolith Soft from making the same mistakes they had in the past, as Nintendo was much more hands-on with their development teams than either Bandai Namco or Square. Yamagami started providing the team the support and guidance he felt they needed. He understood that their strength was their vision, not their planning, so he assigned a team at Nintendo to collaborate on the project, led by Genki Yokota, who would be the game's co-director and could handle any system-related issues thanks to his experience with RPGs. Yamagami also asked for a prototype of the proposed game, which would consist of one complete area that would be created and then polished to the level of a final shippable product. This would inform the team roughly how long the full game would take to develop and what the challenges of this open world game would be. Luckily for Takahashi, his work on Soma Bringer had prepared him for this new development style, even though there was some initial resistance. But the team had to relent to Yamagami's guidance, yet upon starting development, they discovered it was a much more motivating approach. It gave them goals to work towards and an idea of how much time they'd need to spend to produce one section. Likewise, Takahashi was setting goals for himself, as one of his key tenets for the game was a desire to maintain an ideal balance between gameplay and story. The Xenosaga games and Baten Kaitos had both been called out for the length of their cutscenes and general old-fashioned nature when compared to other RPGs of the time. To that end, the main character's planned ability to get glimpses of the future would also dictate how the battle system would be crafted. During their prototyping, the team decided that turn-based combat didn't gel with the future sight, and that any shifts between the environment and battle arenas would interrupt the gameplay flow. To this end, they decided to make the combat more action-based with no battle transitions. It also played into Takahashi's intent to create a fully open world that would feel overwhelming, akin to an MMO. The sheer scale was due to his desire to have a sense of grandeur to the experience. Exploration would be rewarded, but this also meant that a massive amount of items and accessories had to be developed. The gameplay was also influenced by the trends of both Western and Japanese RPGs, with one of Takahashi's main goals being a reduction in the amount and length of cutscenes compared to those found in Xenosaga. In the years since those games' releases, he found that method had become a creative dead end. The story was crafted by a team of 3 writers: Takahashi himself, Yuichiro Takeda of the Xenosaga anime and Xenosaga on the DS, and Yurie Hattori, who had previously directed the Style Savvy series and Endless Ocean Blue World, and would go on to help write the stories for Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn and Awakening. Takahashi needed this team as he was going to be the director and executive producer of the game, which had been given the name Monado, Beginning of the World, and was announced as such at E3 2009. So writing the script in addition to his other responsibilities would simply be too much. Getting Takeda's assistance once again was almost a necessity, especially because he wanted someone outside the gaming industry to provide a different perspective on the story's pacing. In much the same way, Hattori was chosen due to her experience with scenarios in Nintendo games, which Takahashi and Yamagami felt would provide an objective viewpoint on the proposed story scenarios. As they began work on the script, Takahashi felt that a key element would be a contrasting sense of scale. In essence, keeping things personal for the characters while taking part in a journey that only becomes more epic as time goes on. In the case of Takeda, this was the first time he had worked on a project so massive, and it was once again more difficult than he had initially imagined. But it also offered an element of freedom in terms of his dramatic expression. In fact, when they first began writing, Takahashi didn't give exact instructions to Takeda. Instead, he supplied a rough outline that they worked on together before passing the developing script to Hattori and the rest of the Nintendo team. This allowed them to smooth over anything that wasn't working, while Hattori pointed out any flaws and gaps wherever she felt aspects needed to be made clearer to the player. Takahashi in particular strove to have a more mature and subdued writing style compared to other RPGs. The ending in particular took a lot of time, as although the two men felt they had created something satisfactory, Hattori felt it was still obtuse. Upon looking it over again, the duo rewrote it to be more player-friendly rather than something only those in the writing process would understand. It was the type of feedback that helped Takahashi craft a more focused storyline when compared to his past works, and that focus also applied to the main character himself, who had been given the name Shulk. Takahashi had noticed that the main protagonist tended to be easily disliked in other RPGs, with other characters usually becoming the fan favorite. In an effort to combat this, he proposed making the character a silent protagonist, but the staff strongly disapproved of the idea. So instead, he set out to make the dialogue between the party and NPCs feel as natural and in character as possible, emphasizing the party's friendship. And at nearly every turn, Hattori's guiding hand helped in this process. As an example, Takahashi and Takeda wanted to emphasize the bond between Shulk and his friend Fiora, so they had him touch her cheek. Upon seeing this, Hattori felt that the act would come across as creepy, so it was changed to touching her hand. Another scrapped idea was that one of the other party members would betray Shulk and go on to become the final boss, but Takahashi rejected it as it would go against player expectations. Likewise, the design and voices of the characters were just as important to him, with Riki cited as a perfect example. On paper, the character comes across as highly unlikable, and yet his design and voice acting counterbalanced those points. In the end, the story went through so many revisions that Takahashi has since forgotten what his original concept was, though he maintains that the basic framework stayed the same throughout development. But perhaps the most important moment in Monado's production came when the team ran into difficulties, forcing a deflated Takahashi to go to Nintendo with a list of suggestions on what they could cut to make the projected deadline. Instead, he was shocked that Yamagami rejected all those cuts and insisted that the team persist with their vision, guaranteeing that he would persuade Nintendo to continue their support. He succeeded, shocking Takahashi, as nothing like this had ever happened in his time at Bandai Namco. To say that the project was a work of passion for Takahashi is an understatement. He was involved in every aspect of its development, including debugging. After all, this was a game designed to re-energize Monolith as a whole after the relative failure of Xenosaga. And in recognition of that, as well as honoring Takahashi's past works, Satoru Iwata suggested a name change. And that is how Xenoblade Chronicles was born. As envisioned by Takahashi, the world of Xenoblade Chronicles was nothing but an endless ocean until two godlike titans, the Bionis and the Mechonis, came into existence. The two battled to a stalemate, leaving only their stiff corpses behind. Over the course of eons, multiple forms of life developed on their bodies. Flora, fauna, and humanoid races, namely the human-like Homs, the small furry Napon, and the winged people of the High Entia sprang up on the Bionis. But the Mechonis' body led to the creation of the machine-like Mechon. The people of Bionis must fight against the Mechon in order to survive, leading to a war that was only ended thanks to a sword known as the Monado, the only means of effectively getting past the Mechon's armor. But while the war may have ended, the threat did not. A young man named Shulk, who lives in a village simply called Colony 9, has been researching the Monado in an attempt to discover its secrets. Anyone who wields it faces terrible pain, with only a war hero named Dunban able to withstand its side effects, though even he has lost the use of one of his arms due to the toll. Still, an attack by the Mechon leads Shulk to take hold of the Monado, only to discover that not only can he wield it without the side effects, but he is given glimpses of the future as well. Now he must set out with his friends on a journey of revenge and discovery to stop the Mechon threat, learn more about the people of Bionis, and perhaps even untangle the true history of this world. And in comparison to the Xenosaga games, which tended to be quite linear, Xenoblade Chronicles is a massive open world with each area able to be freely visited and returned to. This is facilitated by encouraging exploration, which not only awards experience with each new area discovered, but landmarks that make fast travel possible. There's also a day-night cycle that affects the appearance of side quests, available items, and when certain enemies appear. However, the player can freely change the time of day so that these events can easily be accessed. This focus on player convenience also applies to side quests, as many don't require returning to the quest giver and will instead complete automatically once the conditions are fulfilled. Glowing orbs also dot all locations, marking special items that can be entered into the game's Collectopedia. The more it's filled in, the more special items are rewarded. Some of these rewards can take the form of gems, which can be assigned to equipment with open slots, affecting their stats and allowing for some customization. Speaking of, each piece of equipment is reflected on the characters, significantly changing their appearance depending on what's equipped. Another key component is the affinity system, which tracks the relationships between the characters and even towns across the game. Every named character spoken to will fill the affinity chart, and how they relate to one another will be indicated. By completing quests, these relationships can change and evolve, making the world feel alive. This also increases the affinity level, which will unlock more side quests and stories to experience. Likewise, the greater the party affinity, the more efficient characters will be at working together, both in battle and in the gem crafting minigame. Abilities can even be shared to make them stronger as a whole. This affinity is built up by having characters battle together, as the party can be freely changed to include any character, and giving gifts. But perhaps more importantly, it opens up heart-to-hearts as two characters become closer, which not only helps increase affinity further, but provides a window into a character's personality and history, creating a deeper bond with the player as well, but not diverting from the core story if the player doesn't actually care. The combat is in real time and takes place on the field with no transitions. The player chooses which character to control, with the other two handled by AI. Each character auto-attacks in set intervals, while manual attacks, labeled arts, are triggered by the player. After each use, that art will require a cooldown before it can be used again. These arts are lined along a battle palette that can be customized outside of combat, both in terms of what's chosen and by using earned points from the fights to make them stronger and with less of a cooldown. While there's no items in battle, there are healing arts that can keep the characters alive. Meanwhile, a party gauge will fill during combat with 3 segments in total. One segment can be used to revive a fallen party member, including yourself, but having all 3 allows the use of a chain attack where each character unleashes arts in a row for even greater damage. However, this could leave them vulnerable as the party gauge will be depleted. To properly balance this, an aggro ring will indicate which character is being targeted by the enemy. Naturally, the player's goal is to have the tank characters be the one targeted, but this can be tricky as overuse of arts could lead to another character being targeted instead. The arts have an extra bit of strategy as well, since some are more effective when positioned in a certain way. Backslash will obviously do more damage when used against an enemy's back. It also introduces the evolution of the break system, as certain arts can put enemies into a break status, which makes them vulnerable to being toppled and unable to attack, and then dazed to prolong that state. While there's still more nuance to this battle system, the final element is Shulk's visions, which allow him to see glimpses of an enemy's future attacks and take the steps to possibly prevent it. And more of these types of abilities will unlock as the story progresses. The game would finally release in June of 2010 in Japan, while a European release came a year later in August of 2011. However, despite the confirmation of a European localization, no official confirmation was ever given for a North American one. This was strange, as the project had been announced at E3 2009, yet did not appear at all during E3 2011. In fact, the marketing manager of Nintendo France stated that Nintendo of Europe had wanted to show the game at the show, but Nintendo of America wouldn't allow it. Out of speculation that the game would not be released in North America, a fan campaign dubbed Operation Rainfall was started. The goal was to raise fan awareness of 3 Wii RPGs with potential, namely Xenoblade Chronicles, Pandora's Tower, and The Last Story. The group organized emails, campaigns, online petitions, phone calls, and messages on Nintendo's Twitter and Facebook accounts. One of the most successful efforts was a call to pre-order the game under its original Monado Beginning of the World placeholder on Amazon, which resulted in the game becoming #1 on its pre-order charts, beating both Ocarina of Time 3D and the PS3 bundle that included Call of Duty Black Ops. Developers also joined in the campaign, notably Xenosaga and Mistwalker, developers of The Last Story. Even Takahashi stated that the game was developed assuming it would be released overseas. While Nintendo of America stayed tight-lipped for months about a release, they did acknowledge the demand. And finally, it paid off when a listing was discovered at GameStop. It wasn't long after that Nintendo officially revealed that Xenoblade Chronicles would be released. Reggie Fils-Aimé claimed that NOA had been considering the American release while Operation Rainfall was active, and although the campaign didn't factor into their decision, they did take it into account on whether the release would be profitable. So finally, in April of 2012, the long-fought-for RPG released in North America exclusively to Nintendo's American store and GameStop. The effort paid off as Xenoblade Chronicles saw near universal acclaim across each region, with many Western websites giving it perfect or close to perfect scores. Many cited the story as a high point, as it seemed fairly standard from the premise, yet innovated in many ways. The open world was also seen as a welcome change for the genre, as many worried that RPGs would become more like Final Fantasy XIII's linearity. The battle system and player conveniences were praised as well, with the only common criticism being the unpolished graphics. To many, it brought Japanese RPGs back into the limelight, silencing critics of the time that their games were becoming irrelevant while showcasing what Monolith was capable of. In Japan, it sold 80,000 units in its first week and 161,000 copies by the end of the year, making it the 8th best-selling Wii game of 2010. By 2013, it would reach 200,000 units sold in the country. As for the UK, the game debuted at number 7 and ultimately reached number 2 despite stock shortages. Unfortunately, solid sales numbers in North America are unavailable due to its retailer exclusivity. However, it was estimated to be one of the best-selling games of its release month alongside Mass Effect 3 and Prototype 2. It was finally confirmed in a later interview that the game sold better in the West than it did in Japan. It had taken some time, but the idea and the dedication had paid off. This success led to two significant events. First, Nintendo would buy the remaining shares of Monolith Soft from Bandai Namco, and second, Monolith would open a new studio in Kyoto, allowing it to be closer to Nintendo. This branch would also serve as a support studio, helping with everything from Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild to Animal Crossing New Leaf and New Horizons, along with both Splatoon games. Of course, they developed their own titles as well, and first up was a sequel to Namco X Capcom, dubbed Project Cross Zone. Released in 2012, the game mostly follows the same formula as its predecessor, with characters from Namco, Capcom, and now Sega interacting as they work to stop a new threat. However, this game actually saw a localization, in part thanks to the suggestion of Tekken producer Katsuhiro Harada. His insistence paid off as the game was a surprise success, selling 85,000 copies in its first week in Japan, and 10 times the amount they expected in the West. Ultimately, it sold over 400,000 copies, making it a solid hit. That said, it suffered from many of the same criticisms as its prequel. The story was confusing and the gameplay could get repetitive despite its chaotic nature. But the sheer fun of seeing characters interact and unleash massive combos was enough to win most critics over. Naturally, Cosmos returned for the game, though this time she was partnered with Telos. Perhaps it's because Monolith Soft developed the game, but the inclusion of Xenosaga characters is significant, as there were characters who had appeared in Namco X Capcom but didn't return here, such as Klonoa. It indicated that at least Cosmos was still popular amongst the fandom, something evidenced continuously over the years. That said, Xenoblade Chronicles had the potential to be even bigger, considering what its first crossover would be. That's because on August 29, 2014, it was revealed that Shulk was going to be part of Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS, marking not only an exciting moment for his fans, but a potential turning point for Xenoblade Chronicles as a franchise. The effect that Smash Bros. Could have on a series thanks to a character's inclusion cannot be underestimated, as it famously led to the localization of Fire Emblem in the West. Exposing Shulk to a wider audience could only help the potential series, especially with the love and care Smash developers put into the character's legacy. His animations, his moveset, and the many references to the game itself could pique the curiosity of a newcomer. and it seems Nintendo realized this, as it was also announced that Xenoblade Chronicles would be getting a port to the newly announced new Nintendo 3DS. Released worldwide in April of 2015, Xenoblade Chronicles 3D was co-developed by Monster Games, who had previously developed both Excite Truck and Excite Bots, along with the 3DS port of Donkey Kong Country Returns. Their help was requested as Monolith was already busy at work on its next Xenoblade game. However, the development was unsurprisingly difficult, if only because of the sheer size of Xenoblade's world. Initial testing showed that the original 3DS lacked the memory and power to actually run the game. They then learned of the upcoming new 3DS and its increased power, so it was decided to make Xenoblade Chronicles 3D exclusive to that in order to continue the project. It also helped that the new system's extra buttons made it simpler to port over the controls of the original game. The decision was then made to move as much information as possible to the bottom screen to keep the top screen decluttered while still maintaining the feel of the original. The port was incredibly ambitious for the hardware, as technical tricks that the team still haven't revealed were utilized to maintain a steady frame rate and the seamless exploration of the various environments. They also wanted to include 3D despite the extra difficulties that entailed. But the most difficult part of the project was rebuilding and optimizing all of the environments in a new graphics engine that still maintained the original aesthetic. There were a few new features included in the port as well, namely the collection mode where play coins earned from Street Pass or the Shulk amiibo could be used to unlock models of the various characters and music for a jukebox. While critics praised the fact that the game was ported to the system at all, it was still seen as an overall downgrade due to the poor graphics and 3D effects. The fact that it was limited to the new 3DS didn't help sales either, as it only sold 78,000 copies in its first 3 months in Japan. It fared about the same in the West. However, at least in Japan, it would only be a month until the next major Xenoblade entry was released.
The alien blitz was unrelenting. If not for the efforts of a lone hero, we would never have survived. Our ship took heavy damage. We lost control.
Initially revealed with just the moniker of X, Xenoblade Chronicles X would be Monolith Soft's most ambitious project to date. No one quite knew what it would be like and questioned whether it would be a sequel or something else entirely within the Xeno series. Thanks to the presence of mechs, some even wondered if it was a kind of remake or sequel to Xenogears. But that was not the case. Instead, it was more of a spiritual successor, both to that game and the original Xenoblade. It carries many of the same themes, except with a much more obvious science fiction setting. As to what the X actually meant, well, it was multiple things. In Japan, it was cross, and how there would be meetings between different races and interactions between players online. In the West, X was explained to stand for the unknown, whether that was the alien races or the alien planet. The story focuses on the survivors of an Earth that was caught in the crossfire of an alien war. Humanity attempts to flee the planet on multiple ships, but only a handful are able to make it out. One of which is the White Whale, which is carrying the city of New Los Angeles. However, it still suffers damage and is forced to crash land on the planet Mythra. Now, the survivors must establish New LA while exploring the massive world of Mythra, from its people to its flora and fauna. Unlike the original game, the main character is completely player created, from their gender to their body type to their voice, though they only speak attack names. Their default name is Cross, and they join up with a myriad of different people within New LA's Blade unit, most prominently the leader of Blade, Elma, and the young engineer Lynn. Their goal is to find the scattered survivors and a special piece of the White Whale called the Lifehold, where the majority of New LA's residents lie in stasis. However, one side of the alien war, the Ganglion Alliance, desires to destroy all remnants of humanity and races to find the Lifehold first, while also attempting to destroy the new settlement. Of course, far more is happening than is apparent at the outset, as new mysteries abound the more Mythra is explored. Much of the staff that worked on the original Xenoblade Chronicles also developed X, with many fulfilling the same roles. Takahashi had approached Yamagami with the idea of a more science fiction influenced RPG. Yamagami and Nintendo agreed, curious to see what the team could do on the Wii U. And what Monolith would do was craft one of the most massive open worlds to date, while simultaneously creating the ideal mech game that they had wanted to develop for years. One in which it was possible to go anywhere at any time, whether it was by walking, driving, or even flying. But that vision came at a cost, as it was initially intended to release early in the Wii U's lifetime. Instead, discussions on how to realize the ideas for X took 6 months, with the game getting pushed back due to other issues as well. One of those was fitting the game onto a single 32GB Wii U disc, something that only happened just barely. Aiding that goal to keep the file size down was the decision to not utilize cutting-edge graphics technology. It was their first HD game, so the team chose to avoid that in an effort to better acclimate to this shift. It was then decided to build the battle system upon the basics of the original Xenoblade, with a greater focus on speed to make it feel more like an action game. Takahashi also made the active decision to not include healer classes, as he felt most players would grow tired of the role. The game was actively aimed at more hardcore RPG players while trying to relate the vast amount of information in an understandable way. Takahashi also wanted to encourage criticism from players, as he could then use the feedback to improve future projects, especially since he felt he had received too little for the original Xenoblade Chronicles. As with that game, Takahashi created most of the main scenario himself, while Takeda returned as his co-writer. The two quickly decided that they could not write the entire story, as it was estimated to be significantly bigger than the previous game. Takeda suggested bringing in Kazuho Hyodo, a longtime writer from the Gundam series, as he was experienced with science fiction stories. Thanks to that background, Takahashi felt that he could leave the story in his hands, despite this being the first game that Hyodo had worked on. In an effort to differentiate from their past games, it was decided early on to move away from the philosophical storylines Monolith had become known for. More than anything though, creating Mythra was the main priority of development as work began, similar to how it was with Xenoblade Chronicles. It didn't take long to decide that one planet would be the focus, as stretching it out over several might limit the player experience. Instead, this one planet would feature 5 distinct continents that could seamlessly be traveled between. However, to keep the creation of this world manageable, they decided to use as few unique assets as possible while still creating a varied selection of environments. The map was then estimated to be roughly 5 times bigger than Xenoblade Chronicles, which proved to be especially problematic, to the point that they almost considered scrapping the idea. Fortunately, the team found a way to make it work, while simultaneously designing the structure so it would run smoothly even without the game being able to be installed on the Wii U. How players discovered more of Mythra was also highly considered before settling on a hexagonal map structure that denoted unlockable information points designed to guide players across the world. The restrictive nature of the story also served to ease players into just how big Mythra really was. Players would begin only being able to explore on foot, slowly taking in the scope of this world. Then, after a certain point, mechs would be made available that made traversing Mythra much faster. And finally, a flight system would eventually be installed on the mech, allowing players to go anywhere they wanted and uncover all of Mythra's secrets if they chose. Once the foundation and traversal of Mythra was settled, Takahashi shifted his focus back to the story. His initial draft was roughly the size of a novel, but Takeda picked out the tales that best fit the game's content and scale. These were then turned into scripts. In the end, it took 1.5 years to write the main story and the quests within the game. And this effort was made even more massive due to the decision to have voice acting for most of it, including during battle, as this had made the original Xenoblade stand out. This led to around 11,000 lines being written for the game, an amount so huge that some of the actors would lose their voice during battle line recordings. A factor in the sheer amount of these battle lines could be attributed to the decision to include a player-created character. Initially, the game was written with a set main character in mind who had their own narrative and personality. However, about midway through development, it was decided that an online element was going to be included, forcing the writing team to shift drastically. This changed the flow of the story and resulted in several characters, including another villain, being cut. And yet, despite all these difficulties in development, Takahashi has stated that creating Xenoblade Chronicles X accomplished one of his longtime goals since the founding of Monolith Soft. It's little wonder either, as the mechs were a major focus and allowed for an incredible amount of customization. It's something that must have appealed to the man who lined his desk with Gundam figures once he began development of Xenogears. In terms of gameplay, while much of it is an evolved take on the systems of the original game, there are plenty of changes to make it feel unique. One of which are the various types of missions. Unlike Xenoblade Chronicles, the focus isn't as much on the main story, but instead on the trials of the people of New LA. There are story missions that obviously advance the plot alongside affinity missions, which provide development for the various primary characters you meet, along with the 7 playable characters that will automatically join and 11 other characters that can be recruited. Each of these scenarios are fully voiced and can unlock the optional characters for the party, as well as unique arts for Cross. Which missions were available was determined by how much of Mythra had been explored, as well as the progress of the main story. Players can also choose between different divisions within Blade itself, each of which provide their own advantages. While they can be swapped between at any time, it's not exactly necessary. Exploration has been expanded with fall damage being removed and players able to rapidly run and jump across the land. Once the mechs, called Skells, are eventually unlocked, it becomes apparent that they work remarkably close to the gears in Xenogears, a deliberate callback. In battle, the player is joined by 3 other party members that are once again AI controlled. Battles mostly play out like those in Xenoblade Chronicles in terms of the auto attack and the usage of arts. However, each character can switch between a melee and a ranged weapon at any time. The ranged weapon does less damage but draws less aggro from the enemy, while the melee weapon is more powerful and thus draws more aggro. Swapping between them is necessary for the tank of the party to maintain their role. When an art is ready, it can be powered up further during battle by not selecting it right away, allowing time for a second bar to fill to trigger an overcharge. However, this can only be done if the associated weapon is active at the time. Another new aspect are the tension points, or TP. Some arts require TP to be used, and these are replenished through standard attacks. Wise management of TP is a necessity though, as it's also how allies are revived in battle. Arts are determined by a character's class, with 6 that the player can eventually choose between, each with their own specializations. And if a class is fully mastered, the abilities found there can be combined with those of another. Other party members are assigned one of these classes, which provides some strategy to the party composition. That said, there is indeed no healing role within the game. Instead, certain arts can perform limited healing, but it's primarily tied to the soul voice systems. Occasionally during battle, a simple quick-time event will appear. Timing it right will slightly heal the party and increase morale, allowing them to fight even more effectively. Combat with Skells mostly work the same, except the arts available are tied directly to the parts equipped to the mech. It obviously does much more damage, allowing the player to take on even bigger enemies, or laying waste to smaller ones. Of course, there's the online element as well. By connecting online, players could loan their avatars to other players' parties and form units called squads. These squads include up to 32 players, enabling the group to participate in battles together or even share tasks. These tasks involved collecting resources and completing them awarded the squad with more items and equipment. The online was designed to counteract the feeling of isolation players would experience while exploring Mythra, though Monolith intentionally made most of the online interaction background elements as they wanted players to still be able to play alone without disruptions. Unfortunately, none of this is currently available since Nintendo shut down the Wii U servers. There is much more to the gameplay, including being able to target specific spots on an enemy to weaken it, the gamepad functionality which allows players to place data points for various effects while exploring Mythra, and the way New LA evolves as time goes on. It was truly massive in scope. Critically, Xenoblade Chronicles X was well received, though not as strongly as the previous game. The gameplay, the world, and the graphics were all high points, but many found the fetch quest tiresome with the lack of direction. The main narrative was also considered weaker and less charming, but many overlooked the issue when the gameplay could be so engrossing and rewarding. Commercially, X was the 3rd best-selling game in its release week in Japan, selling around 85,000 physical units. It was also the most downloaded title in Japan for May, surpassing other games like Minecraft, Bravely Second, and The Witcher 3. By the time the game was released in the West, it sold over 200,000 copies, nearly doubling the lifetime sales in Japan at that point. But perhaps most importantly, X served to lay the groundwork that Monolith Soft could build upon for their next game, making the development time of that future title far shorter. But before that game, it was time for one more crossover title in November of 2015, thanks to the release of Project Cross Zone 2. As before, characters from Namco, Capcom, and Sega came together, along with a few special guests from Nintendo, namely from Fire Emblem Awakening and Xenoblade Chronicles. It mostly plays the same as the original, except with more new characters and a plot that was designed to be less confusing. This led it to be just as warmly received, with many lauding the silly fun of so many characters interacting. And those characters included the returning Cosmos, who this time was paired with a special character from Xenoblade Chronicles. Meanwhile, Telos returned as a boss alongside Metalface from Chronicles, while various normal enemies from both Saga and Chronicles could be fought. Just seeing the characters from both Xeno games interact highlights what makes the Project Crosszone games so much fun for longtime fans of the various games. While the game was a fun side project, it was 2017 that would end up as a banner year for Monolith Soft, as it showcased their talents both as a support studio and as a developer. Not only did their Kyoto studio bring their knowledge of open worlds to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but it would aid in the development of Splatoon 2. Both would mark the year as some of Nintendo's strongest releases and catapulted the success of the newly released Switch, along with several other marquee titles. One of those was a sequel that had been in development at Monolith since 2014, and would become their most successful game to date.
Just leave it out!
Give it a rest, Malos! Can't you see he's just a child?
A child? Don't make me laugh. This kid has made himself the Aegis of Driver!
Xenoblade Chronicles 2 returned the series to a more story-driven experience after a decidedly split fan reaction to X's focus on discovery and exploration. That story would take place in the entirely new world of Allrest. There, giant creatures known as Titans live atop the Cloud Sea, providing both transportation and living space to the many different races of Allrest. At the center of the sea is a massive landmark known as the World Tree, which is said to lead to a paradise called Elysium, where the creator of this world, the Architect, dwells. Unique to this world are the beings known as Blades, which come from core crystals and bond with the person who awakens them, known as the Driver. It's in this world that a young salvager named Rex tries to earn a living while supporting his hometown. So when a high-paying job falls into his lap, he's more than willing to join 3 members of a group known as Torna to discover a lost ship. What he doesn't know is that inside this ship is a legendary blade known as the Aegis that he inadvertently awakens. Circumstances soon bind his life to the Aegis, called Pyra, and he must now learn what it means to be a driver while fending off those that would take her. Together, they hope to find a way to the paradise of Elysium. From this description, it seems obvious that Xenoblade Chronicles 2 isn't a direct sequel to the original. The developers explained that the 2 is due to it following the basic gameplay and story focus of that game. That said, there is something rewarding for those who have played through the first game. In any case, one of Monolith's objectives was to give characters a wider range of facial expressions in an effort to better convey the story. It was decided that Masatsugu Saito would be brought in as lead character designer, as he had previously worked on animes such as Rakuen Suiho, Expelled from Paradise, and Cyborg 009, Call of Justice. This would be his first time designing characters for a video game though. The idea was that he would be able to give the protagonist more expressive features when compared to previous Xenoblade games, especially as the team found the more realistic models utilized there to be a bit stiff. But it wasn't just Saito brought in for character design. Every rare blade was created by a different artist from across the video game and anime industry. In fact, both Cosmos and Telos made cameos as blades while sporting slight redesigns. But it was Square Enix's Tetsuya Nomura that Takahashi would specifically seek out for certain character designs. He had wanted to work with him for some time, although he expected Square would deny the request. To his surprise, they accepted, leading to Nomura designing all the members of the Torna organization. The writing team once again consisted of Takahashi, Takeda, and Hyodo, and followed the arrangements of their previous collaborations. In many ways, their techniques and workflow on the game was much like that of a movie, and one of the team's first decisions was to not have Allrest be one big interconnected world. Each area would be separated and rest upon its own titan, providing different vistas while remaining huge in scope. However, they weren't so big that connecting them would equal the surface area of Mythra. That's because Takahashi was more interested in increasing the density of each location to pack in as much variety as possible. And this idea is reflected in the side quests, as the total amount was decreased compared to previous Xenoblade entries while making them more involved. They also intentionally made these side stories lighter in tone, as the main plot could get heavy at times. In regards to the blades, one of their earlier ideas was to have them be more like Ultraman in that they tower over the driver. But they simply couldn't put something that big on screen in the middle of battle, so they were made more human in size. That being said, it looks like they came back to at least a version of this idea for Xenoblade Chronicles III's Ouroboros mechanic. Ultimately, Takahashi drew upon another childhood favorite, Galaxy Express 999, and its theme of boy meets girl. As there were so many games at the time featuring characters living in savage worlds, he wanted to draw upon an innocent, childlike mind and base the characters on that idea. At its core, Xenoblade Chronicles II is much like the previous games as players explore huge landscapes with battles taking place on the field. However, the combat saw a significant overhaul. Unlike the previous games, arts need to be charged through successful auto-attack strikes. Each character only has 3 driver arts as determined by their currently equipped blade, but that blade supplies blade arts that act as buffs for their driver. By using the driver arts, a special gauge will increase, with more being filled thanks to proper timing during the auto attacks. These have a distinct 3-hit pattern, and activating the art when the 3rd attack hits will fill the special gauge even more. The gauge can then reach 4 levels of intensity, with each becoming more powerful. However, specials also tie into 2 distinct combo systems, driver combos and blade combos. Driver combos is a continuation of Xenoblade's break system, with certain arts able to cause break, topple, and then the new launch and smash effects. Blade combos are tied into the specials, as using one begins the process, increasing the damage dealt. To begin the combo, a special equal to or greater than the combo level must be used, so it's a good idea to use level 1, then 2, then 3, with the entire party contributing to this combo. The player would be notified when another character had a special ready, and could order them to unleash it despite otherwise not having direct control. The element of the blade also ties into the special, with unique effects being unleashed thanks to specific combinations. 3 drivers make up the party, with each driver having access to 3 blades that can be actively swapped mid-battle, allowing the player to change tactics on the fly or better set up their combos to take down enemies. However, obtaining blades is a somewhat random process as they are awakened from their core crystals. These can be common blades, which mostly share the same design but have randomized weapons and elements, or rare blades which have unique designs and tend to be more powerful. Every blade also has an affinity chart that not only makes them more powerful, but in the case of rare blades, can provide more character development. Xenoblade 2 is filled with systems that utilize the blades in various ways, such as sending extra units to do bonus missions that further unlock items and money while filling in the blade's affinity chart. Heart-to-hearts once again return and are fully voiced, adding to the blade's characterizations. The party gauge is back as well, fulfilling its role of reviving fallen party members for 1 bar or unleashing a chain attack for the entire gauge. Chain attacks can be even more devastating as an elemental orb is released each time a blade combo is completed. By selecting the opposing element, these orbs can be destroyed, which both extends the chain attack and increases its damage output. And that's just the combat, as there are plenty of activities outside of battle as well. It's a lot to take in, and the game attempts to gradually teach it all, but the tutorials have seen a lot of criticism for being generally unclear with no way to refresh yourself on the mechanics. Despite that issue, the game was lauded by critics upon release, with many highlighting its strong story, diverse world, and engaging combat. Some felt there were far too many tutorials due to the many layers of combat and options in general, while others criticized the blades themselves. With so many different artists, there were those who felt the graphics didn't allow the characters to mesh into a cohesive whole. Instead, many came across as heavily sexualized, which some felt took away from the strong character development many exhibited. This may be due to the fact that the artists were basically free to design blades however they wanted, but the game was seen as gorgeous overall, at least when the Switch was docked. Xenoblade Chronicles II would go on to become the best-selling game in the Xeno series, and the speed at which it did was incredible. 98,000 copies were sold in its first week in Japan, and 168,000 by the end of its first month. In terms of worldwide sales, over 1 million units were sold in that same period. It only took 4 more months for it to break the series' sales record, as well as become Monolith Soft's best-selling game ever. Takahashi soon stated that his expectations had been far exceeded, especially in terms of its Western sales. By the end of 2020, the game had sold 2.17 million units worldwide, making it the 39th best-selling game on the Switch, at least in terms of reported sales. But development of Xenoblade Chronicles II wasn't quite over upon release. Free updates were released several times, adding new quests, quality of life improvements, and expanded New Game Plus features. There was also DLC in the form of the Expansion Pass. Over the course of 2018, new quests, new rare blades, and a challenge battle arena were added to the game. Winning in the arena could unlock new equipment such as swimsuits for the party, and even Shulk, Fiora, and Elma from past Xenoblade games as special blades. But the biggest reason to pick up the Expansion Pass was the actual expansion, Torna, the Golden Country. This expansion was originally considered to be a part of the main story of Xenoblade Chronicles II, related at a key moment in the plot. But the team at Monolith realized that the prototype they had developed shouldn't even be shown to Nintendo, as it would have significantly inflated the budget and development time. And considering that they had promised to release the game early in the Switch's lifespan, this section would absolutely derail that. Instead, Takahashi put the concept aside and stored it on his hard drive. When the possibility of an expansion pass arose, the team returned to the concept. Set 500 years before the events of Xenoblade Chronicles II, Torna focused on the characters of Jin and Laura and how their lives influenced the events of the main game. It allowed players to properly meet characters that were only mentioned, or see how established characters acted differently in the past. The game could be played and enjoyed with no prior knowledge of Xenoblade Chronicles II, but it's generally recommended to play the original game first. Much of the expansion was heavily influenced by the massive amount of feedback Monolith Soft received from new players regarding 2's gameplay systems. Many had found the combat to be intimidating and confusing, so the team made a point of designing the gameplay to be easier to pick up and play, while providing more tutorials for the more complex aspects. The map was also streamlined to be clearer to players. Amusingly, Takahashi found the biggest difficulty was balancing the story and gameplay for a 20-hour RPG, something he was not used to, as most of his games tended to last 80 hours at minimum. While the battle system followed most of the concepts of the base games, such as driver combos, blade combos, fusion combos, special attacks, and chain attacks, it also introduced elements to help keep everything streamlined. Aiding this was the set amount of blades in the expansion, so that the final party would consist of 9 characters in total, a driver and 2 blades. However, blades could be directly controlled this time around, creating vanguard and rearguard roles. Both units actively attacked, and swapping the 2 could be done at any time, with the switch performing another action if timed well, along with slightly healing the pair. A new community system was introduced that acted as a less complex version of the affinity chart from the original Xenoblade. Named characters would be listed, and completing side quests for them would add them as supporters. The more people that were helped, the higher the community level would become. Camping was also introduced, which combined the functionality of inns, crafting, and heart-to-hearts. The expansion was well received, with many finding it stronger in some ways than the main game. The battle system was simpler to understand while still providing depth, and the more mature story was welcomed by many. Special attention was paid to the characters, especially that of Laura and the struggle she goes through during the expansion. However, the community system presented issues. While the idea itself was fine, story progression would be locked until a certain community level was reached, which practically made most of the side quests required. Most didn't mind, as they would do those quests anyway, but those who just wanted to see the story, especially on repeat playthroughs, found the decision frustrating. While sales numbers weren't revealed, Takahashi did note that the expansion also exceeded his expectations. With the success of Xenoblade Chronicles II and Torna, Monolith Soft and Nintendo decided that the many new players to the franchise might be interested in the original. Thus, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition was released in May of 2020. The process of bringing the game to the Switch was made easier thanks to the rendering engine they had developed for their previous Switch games. With it, they could immediately create new assets, while existing data was converted to HD using a semi-automatic conversion process. Once that was finished, the artist could add specific touches to complete the upgrade. The trickier task was actually the controls. Most of the code had to be rewritten with the perspective of a modern mindset. The sheer number of complex specifications within Xenoblade Chronicles made the work extremely challenging, and by the end of development, they kept finding further specifications in the source code that not even the original staff knew about or had since forgotten. Xenoblade Chronicles 3D had provided some of the basis on how the controls could work, but the user interface was overhauled on Switch since the original allowed players to control multiple elements at the same time. This led to the development team playing the game repeatedly before discussing the possible solutions until they felt satisfied. In terms of new features for the game, nothing that was added to Xenoblade Chronicles 3D carried over to the definitive edition. However, the music was remastered while still providing the original versions as an option. The new time attack challenges were the biggest gameplay addition and worked much the same as Xenoblade Chronicles 2's challenge battles. Here, players could earn equipment and gems for the main game, including armor sets that wouldn't typically be available. Finally, there was the Events Theater, another idea brought from Xenoblade 2 that allowed players to rewatch cutscenes and even tweak how they're presented, from the equipment to the time of day and the weather. But the biggest addition for returning players was the epilogue, Future Connected. Set a year after the events of the main game, it sees Shulk, Melia, and two young Nopon traveling to the Bionis' shoulder in hopes of finding the lost city of Alchemoth. There, they learn that the High Entia living on the shoulder have become targets for a new threat known as the Fog King. The story is mainly meant to focus on Melia, as some felt her story was left wanting. Even Takahashi joked that people felt bad for her, so they wanted to amend that in some way. Future Connected was available from the main menu, allowing players to jump in immediately and finally explore the Bionis' shoulder, an area famous amongst fans for being cut from the original release. The epilogue was also teased to be a look at what the future of Xenoblade could look like, though as of this video, it's hard to say what connections Xenoblade Chronicles 3 will have to the scenario. While the gameplay is mostly the same as the main game with materials to find and heart-to-hearts to view, the battle system has been trimmed down to keep it simple as an extra adventure. Shulk and Melia still have access to all their arts, although skill trees are now gone. In addition, the two Nopon take on the roles of party members Ryan and Charla, making them familiar to returning players. The final change involves the Pawn Spectres and their Union Strikes, which replace the chain attacks. These Nopon surveyors are scattered across the shoulder, and finding them will add their power to the Union Strike. However, there is some variation as the Pawn Spectres are from 3 separate teams, with each team providing their own special effect. Red deals major damage to a single enemy, Blue heals the party while casting regen and debuff immunity as well, and Yellow guarantees the day status and strength down to the group of enemies you're fighting. Critics specifically praised Definitive Edition for the extra care put into its design rather than a simple graphical upgrade. The various quality of life improvements were appreciated and eliminated most of the original's archaic elements. While the Future Connected epilogue was considered enjoyable, most didn't find it to be as must-play an experience as the Torna expansion. Instead, it was recommended to those wishing to see more of the characters throughout its 15-hour runtime. The game continued the strong commercial success of the series, selling 1.5 million copies worldwide over the course of 7 months. Thanks to these 3 games on the Switch, there was no denying that Xenoblade had become one of the premier RPGs on the system, and this was firmly solidified on February 17, 2021, when Pyra and Mythra were confirmed as DLC for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's second Fighter's Pass. Like Shulk, Pyra and Mythra were well represented in terms of their moveset and animations. The inclusion also saw Pyra's outfit getting a slight redesign, similar to how Mythra received one for her spirit image. More importantly to Xenoblade fans, the character designer of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 finally created official artwork for a character that had none before. At this point, there seemed to be no doubt. The Xenoblade Chronicles series had become one of Nintendo's staples. The shift at Monolith Soft is nothing short of incredible. Where once the developer struggled to tell its stories, now it has released 3 massive RPGs over the course of 5 years. It's a stark difference to how the studio began. Exploring their worlds and stories has become a highlight for fans, and it's happening once again with the release of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. A new world, new characters, a new battle system, and a story that promises to tie together elements of the first 2 games. In fact, Takahashi has stated that the visual of the Mechonis sword and the wounded Orion Titan was first conceived sometime before the development of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Considering how grand each story Takahashi crafts is, that should come as no surprise. And neither should the return of all the major players of past Xenoblade games to their development positions. How the fanbase will react to this third game is still up in the air as of this video, but if I may inject some personal conjecture, I see no reason to worry. This team has become one of my favorites in gaming largely due to Xenoblade. I'm consistently impressed with how they combine engrossing stories with compelling gameplay set in massive worlds. that Tetsuya Takahashi and his team of passionate developers, writers, artists, and musicians work so hard, often under circumstances that could have easily led to their closure, only to see their visions realized, is simply inspiring. While the quality may vary, I feel that each Xeno game is well worth playing for any RPG fan. But I must say, thank you all for joining me for this fascinating retrospective. I hope I shared some information you may not have known before, or inspired you to check out some of the other games in the Xeno series, or even the games where their characters cameoed. These are some of the most expansive RPGs out there, whether through narrative, gameplay, or both. But how do you feel about the Xeno games? What are some of your favorites? Did you become interested in any of them? Do you plan to pick up Xenoblade Chronicles 3? And if you enjoyed this retrospective, I also released one on the entire Shin Megami Tensei franchise, so if you enjoyed these, let me know if you'd like to see more like them in the future. As always, please consider subscribing to Good Vibes Gaming, hitting the like button, and ringing that bell. We also have a Patreon at patreon.com/gvgaming with plenty of extra perks. Until next time, bye!